Okay, over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Danny. Morning, guys. Thanks for joining the webinar this morning. My name is Joe Hepburn. I head up the data management team here at Byte Software. So my team is a sales specialist overlay division to our account managers and Salesforce, and we look after any technologies in the data space. So it's quite a broad portfolio, but generally rolls up into anything backup, disaster recovery, governance, management, analytics, those kind of areas. A huge topic of conversation that we have found over the last 18 months is around security, and I think I've heard this term two pandemics over the last 18 months, and obviously the pandemic with COVID-19, but also the pandemic with ransomware and malicious attacks on organizations has been a huge topic of conversations for our customers. So we wanted to put on a webinar today just to talk through some of the technology areas and things that we can do to help mitigate that risk and make sure that we're very much at the forefront of combating those bad actors and mitigating the ransomware risk. So with that on the agenda today, sorry, we've got housekeeping rules, apologies. So during the webinar, if you keep muted at all times and submit questions via the questions box, that would be great. If you needed to email any questions over, please send it to tellmemore@bytes.co.uk. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so if you fire in those questions into the box, we will make sure that they're answered. The webinar recording will be made available to everyone tomorrow, so that'll be sent out via Danny and the Bytes marketing team. And please do complete the critique form at the end of the session, because it really helps us to make sure that we're presenting the right content to you as our customers for anything in the future. So our agenda today is going to be talking around reviewing the risks in 2021, as I said, that dual pandemic scenario. Ransomware play-by-play and what that looks like from a malicious activity perspective. How you as an organization are prepared for ransomware, so what are the best practices for security and reducing that blast radius, the response and recovery, and then we'll go through the Q&A. So I will hand over to Tom now from Varonis to go through this. And just to set the scene from a Varonis perspective, Bytes are a platinum Varonis partner and see them very much as a best of breed in terms of understanding your data and securing your data against these ransomware scenarios. So yeah, Tom, over to you.
Thank you. Just to check, you can see my screen okay, Joe?
Yeah, all looks good, Tom.
Yeah, we can see that, Tom. Sorry.
Perfect.
Apologies.
That's all right, no worries. So just as a quick intro, I'm a security architect based in the UK as part of Varonis's incident response team. So day to day, essentially what that means is helping customers with configurations of Varonis, but a large part of that is responding to any incidents we get as well across the customer base. So whether or not it's an alert they haven't seen before, they want a bit of help with, or something a lot more involved, we can help out with that. So just to kick things off, obviously ransomware is nothing new, but what we've seen is kind of a change in the activity around it and the severity of it. So the attacks themselves are becoming more sophisticated. One of the things that means is it's actually happening over a longer period of time. So from that initial infection, you're seeing perhaps weeks or maybe even months where attackers are dwelling in the network before ransomware is actually executed. The upshot of that is if you have decent monitoring and alerting capability, it means that you get a higher chance of being able to stop that activity before any damage is actually done. The other change is whether or not it's because people weren't paying the ransom so much, but there's now the extortion side of it as well. So what they're relying on is taking data before they launch the ransomware, and the idea being that they can either, threaten the public disclosure of that information. There's the issue of brand reputation, etc. from that. The other thing we're seeing is because of the attacks are more sophisticated, a lot of these are coming from APT groups that have, you know, the expertise, the manpowers, and the tool set to gain that initial access. But with a lot of you know, normal corporate targets that wouldn't be traditionally something that an APT group might be explicitly targeting, they're then selling that access on the dark web. So what you see is ransomware as a service. So for a relatively small fee, you can access the tool set or access a network that's already been compromised. There's support teams available for the victims to help them pay the ransom, obviously, and also customers of the ransomware as a service. So it's a real industry now doing that. What essentially happens is the APT group or whoever built the tool set is just taking a cut of the actual ransom for any successful attack. And they even have business analytics around this now as well. So they have a good idea of who can pay the ransom, you know, what verticals they want to go after, how much their insurance premiums may be, etc. And they're even selling or offering out the data before public exposure to the likes of competitors or any interested party. So whether it's, you know, their R&D, their intellectual property, customer lists, that kind of thing. So just very briefly, here's an example of someone selling a tool set online. Now, because it's the dark web, you have no idea whether or not you're actually going to get anything, but this is real, and there are tools available that you can get to quite easily if you go on the dark web. Obviously, it's always in the headlines. It's a very big thing, either just breaches in general, but more specifically ransomware. There's a one thing I should mention is there should be a poll on your screen now if you'd like to answer that. So as I said, it's always hitting the headlines. There's an example there from a large US insurance company paying a $40 million ransom to hackers. It could be quite indiscriminate who they target. So it's kind of across all industries that you need to be aware of it. There was a big one probably a few months ago now. Can be thought of as a supply chain attack, but there was a MSP or a tool used by MSPs that was compromised, and what ended up happening with that was the spread of the ransomware itself was massive. So even if it's not you that's being attacked directly, you just need to be aware of what suppliers you have in your network or what tool sets you're using. So what we're going to do now is go through sort of play-by-play of ransomware actually running. This is going to be obviously a lot shorter version with some of the steps removed, but you should get the idea of it. So in this instance, we're going to start with a phishing email, usually a very effective way of getting into the network. People have also paid off administrators in companies to gain that initial access. There's lots of different methods to get that initial foothold. But what we do is we have an attack machine that you'll see in a moment. And when this person clicks on that link and downloads the file, you can see that the link is actually pointing to Google Drive. They're going to get a document. When they enable it, enable the macros, that's then going to heartbeat back to our attack server, and that'll give us our initial access. So the user will click on that, they'll enable content, and what you'll see almost immediately is on our attack machine that's going to pop up, you'll see that connection happen. So if we give it a few seconds, we can now look at the sessions we have. And there is our access to that engineer on desktop 1. So now what we can do is start the attacks, whether that's some initial reconnaissance via DNS or looking for open network shares, etc. We can start trying to, you know, spread across the network. So what we're going to do in this instance is on the left-hand side, you can see us uploading the tools. We've then used Metaterpreter or Metasploit to use the get system command, which allows us admin on that machine that we have access to, and we've executed our tools. So the first thing we try and do is just a simple password spray attack. It's another way of brute forcing it without triggering a lockout for those accounts. So rather than trying a dictionary against a single user, 100 passwords, 1 or 2 attempts against an account, and then hopefully one of those accounts will have a weak password that's in the dictionary. So in this case, it wasn't successful, but there's another method that we can try and get in there. In this case, we're going to be using Kerberoasting. So that attack runs quite quickly, so I'll give you a bit of a explanation first. So the first thing that we want to do is query the domain for all the available services. So if you're connected to a file server or SQL or something like that, you need to authenticate using Active Directory. So we're going to basically, as a normal user, we can request from the domain, show us all the services that are available to us. And we can see them listed out on screen there. Once we've requested those, we can dump those to memory, dump those out of memory, sorry, and those are the tickets that we're going to try and crack. But before we do that, we want to decide on a target, and the easiest way to do that is to check who's an administrator, because if we're going to go to the effort of trying to crack this offline, we want to make sure it's worth our time and that the account we get at the end of it is one that's going to have extra privileges on the network. So I'll just show that happening now. So we're going to start that ticket harvesting attack. Like I said, we view all the services or accounts with service principal names on them, and we can see those listed out there. Now we're going to dump all of those using Mimikatz. So you'll see all those tickets coming in now. Once we've got those files, we can check to see who's a member of domain admin, and we have a few there. So we have the backup service, IT admin, one for 365, and a proxy account as well. So now we've launched a application called John the Ripper. Essentially, it's just a password cracking or hash cracking tool. One thing to bear in mind when we're doing this is all the while we're trying to crack it, because we have those tickets on disk, we don't need to interact with the domain. So we're not going to be triggering any alerts around, lockouts or brute forcing. Realistically, if you're doing this in a real scenario, you would probably spin up something on AWS or Azure, something with a lot of GPU compute power, and you can just go through that, whether it takes a week or a month. Because it's a service account we're attacking, that password's not likely to have changed. So we're going through that crack now. Eventually, what we'll see is that is successful. We targeted the backup service, and we can see that that password is password 1. So now we have access to that account. Who's a domain admin, we can basically do whatever we like. So whether that's create new users for persistence, set up persistence in other ways, a startup script or change group policy, lots of things we can do. But what we're going to do in this instance is start looking for sensitive data. What we have seen is there was a leak a couple of weeks ago of an APT group's word list, essentially, that they use when they're in someone's network looking for legal documents, anything around intellectual property, client list, customers, financials, all the information that they think is going to be useful to them, and also very worrisome to the victim if that gets leaked. So they use a list like this, much like we're going to do now, although a very simple one. And we're going to connect to that file server using PowerShell, but we're going to do so as that backup service. So when we're looking for these files, we're using that backup service account, so we should have full access to everything. And it's going to iterate through a couple of the finance shares, looking for the words confidential in the document. So what we should see in a minute is documents starting to come back. You can see some listed out there. Once we've got all the data we want, we can then do whatever we like with it. So we're going to take that data out of the network. Lots of ways that we could do that, but we're going to take that data out of the network, and we could then threaten to release that with public disclosure or sell it on to anyone that wants it. So the next step is to take that data that we've got, zip it up into a file, and then we're going to exfiltrate it. There's a few different ways you can do it. You can use DNS exfiltration, so send out the data in little chunks as if they're DNS requests, but we're going to use HTTP post commands to send that bit by bit to anon files, and then we get the link at the end if we want to download that data. So now that data is out of the network, we can get on with the actual bit of the attack that everyone's going to notice, which is the ransomware. So when we launch this now, it's going to happen very quickly, but you'll see the files being encrypted on the left-hand side. You can see the ransom note on screen, and that little pop-up was just a notification from Varonis to the end user to say that we've detected ransomware and that user is going to be disabled and logged off. The reason we do that is to mitigate the spread of that, and the account that was being used in that instance can no longer spread the malware. So rather than looking for an alert, we've proactively stopped that as it was happening. One thing to bear in mind is a lot of the groups that launch these ransomware attacks time it very specifically when they actually want to launch the attack. If you go back to the Kaseya VSA attack, there's a lot of customers in the US, it's probably their largest region, and the attackers actually launched that on the 5th of July weekend, so 4th of July weekend. So a lot of the normal IT admins, etc., security staff were out of the office when this happened, so there was a mad scrabble to try and deal with that. So how do you actually kind of minimize the risk to your organization, and how do you kind of prepare for ransomware? In many cases it's an if, not a when, but what you can do is put stuff in place that makes it a lot harder for that to propagate, and if you do get hit by ransomware, the actual impact is much less. So the first thing is to focus around the data. At the end of the day, what they're looking for is to take your sensitive data, whether that's GDPR regulated data, PCI data, etc. If you know where that data is stored and who has access to it, and there's no excessive file permissions, you're already in a good place. The next thing is something that we've exploited just on that attack a second ago, is have a good idea of your Active Directory estate, what the vulnerabilities are, etc. And the other important thing is having detection, so whether that's logging, a SIM tool, endpoint protection, network detection, etc. You want to layer that up and make sure you have good coverage and you have a good understanding of what's happening day to day. And if you have the logs and you can see what people have been accessing, and ransomware's run, you can see the file operations that have happened, you have a good ability to determine the impact of that, so you know what's been encrypted and you can recover and restore that capability quicker. Obviously, a big thing with this is making sure that you have decent backups. It's immutable storage, and that those backups are offsite as well, so you have multiple copies. So there should be another poll question coming up in just a second. It's just around the access to actual data. So how much data on average is open to everyone on the network. So I'll just give you a few seconds. One of the big things we see is when we're looking, when we're doing trials of Varonis or that kind of thing, or if you just look broadly across industries, you'll see that people have a lot more access to data than they actually need day to day. And when people are leaving or changing roles, for example, that access to data, especially sensitive data, is not always removed. So the most practical approach to kind of protecting yourself is starting with the data. So what we found is, on average, 70% of the sensitive files within an organization are stale. And what we mean by stale is that data that's no longer actively used. Maybe it's exceeded a retention period, but basically it no longer needs to be there. And on average, 20 million files are open to all employees, most of that being sensitive. So all of that data that's open to everyone within the network, that is essentially what we'd refer to as the blast radius. So what we mean by blast radius is the amount of data that a single user could encrypt if they're hit by ransomware. And you can see a stat on the right-hand side that 20 million records, so that's not individual files, but that's customer data, for example, or credit card numbers, are open to every single employee. So that's the kind of data that's going to be exfiltrated, but the 20 million files is going to be the total amount of data that's actually going to be encrypted. So if you can quantify that risk, you have a better idea of what the likely impact would be if someone's hit by ransomware. They click on a phishing email, that single person's infected. So what you can do within Varonis is have visibility of those risks. So what we're looking at the moment is just an example GDPR dashboard. It gives you information around the amount of files that you have and folders containing that GDPR data, the subset of that is open to everyone in the network, the amount that's stale, etc. And what you can then do is use automation to remove that access. So you can see the number of folders with open access drop significantly, and then as that is in place, if any data is opened up, it's proactively, that access is removed, and you can then track that over time to make sure that you're being compliant and that the data is secure, essentially. The other side of that is, of course, Active Directory. So Active Directory is what's being leveraged by the attackers to gain that persistence or elevate their permissions on the network. If you're aware of the at-risk accounts, so the services that are, or the admin accounts that are running services, accounts with no password policy, any accounts that have Kerberos delegation, any of these, myriad of settings within Active Directory that an attacker can take advantage of to gain extra permissions. If you have an awareness of that and any misconfigurations you have, it makes executing a successful attack a lot harder. So how do you proactively reduce the risk of ransomware? So the big one, like I said earlier, is layering those detective and preventative controls. Make sure you've got good endpoint detection for if any malware is found on the endpoint. If you can see PowerShell being accessed, any libraries being accessed that are malicious, things like Mimikatz. But also you have a good idea of the perimeter, so you can see if anyone's coming in, any brute forces that are happening over VPN, or any unusual IPs or countries that you're suddenly seeing on the network. And then in terms of actually reducing the blast radius, it goes back to removing that over permissive access. You're restricting the amount of damage that a single person being infected can do. Make sure that you're following the least privilege model. So if they don't need to access it, remove those rights. Make sure that that's reviewed quarterly, for example. What are people accessing? What department are they in? And what do they need to actually work on? If you restrict that down as much as possible, it can make a massive difference. And then what do you need to be looking for within Active Directory? So any new users being created, an attacker, like when we had control of the backup service account, we could create a new user, give them admin rights on the network, and then that's an account that people perhaps don't know about that has extra permissions on the network. We can go back in using that. Any modifications of group policy objects, so are they introducing vulnerabilities, allowing lower encryption of tickets, changing it so accounts don't have to reset their password every 60 days, 90 days? Can you detect any account enumeration or brute forcing, and just being aware of where the weak points are as well? So one of the things that will go a long way to detecting these kind of attacks, and like I said, the dwell time that we're seeing with ransomware attacks is a lot longer, so you have a lot more chance to catch it earlier in the kill chain. So user behavior analytics basically builds a peacetime profile, or what does normal look like for that user, and then we can detect things like suspicious access to files, accessing servers or machines they're not normally associated with. So A service account logging in interactively to someone's laptop for the first time might mean that that account's been compromised. And then the ransomware activity itself. So are we seeing rapid deletion or modification of files? You know, the extensions change, they're being encrypted. This is great for both spotting insider threats. So if someone's trying to take data, maybe they're moving to a competitor, or they've been fired and they just want to cause issues for them. We can also see any accounts that have been compromised. And even if it's a low and slow type activity, so they're deliberately trying to evade things like user behavior analytics or alerts in a SIM, you can usually pick that kind of activity up because that slow deviation over time will add up, and you can see that people are accessing stuff they shouldn't. And ultimately, that means that you can catch the attackers earlier in the kill chain. Maybe they don't get as far as exfiltrating the data. Maybe they don't even get as far as going past reconnaissance. So if you can see the DNS activity, it looks like someone's doing a network scan, etc., it gives you a point to then do the investigation. So now we're going to move on to more Varonis specific stuff. So how does it work in practice? So what we're doing is anything that we're connected up to, so whether that's your on-prem file servers, Microsoft 365s, the likes of Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, Box, the perimeter telemetry, so VPN, proxy, and DNS, and Active Directory. We're looking for all the activity from there. We're taking the logs, and when we get those logs, we're then enriching them with the extra information we have on the platform. So we know the account types, we know if someone's an executive, an admin, a standard user, or a service account, and that means that from a user behavior perspective, we can treat those differently, those different account types. We know the sensitivity of the data, so whether it's GDPR data that's being accessed, is that normal for that person? We've got device resolution, so that's one of the ways that we can tell if the device we're seeing the activity from is a personal device, you know, it's associated with one person that's logged in same time every day, logs out same time every night. We know their working hours. And then looking at things like 365 and VPN, we also have information about where they're coming from externally, you know, what location. Is it a country that you don't operate in? Have we seen them dart around from the UK, then they're suddenly in China, then in the US? All those things that might be suspicious. So we use all those logs to build that behavioral baseline or normal profile for a person. So we've got the example of David on the screen. We know he's an executive. We know the laptop he normally works from. He's in the US, and what type of data he's accessing. When we see a meaningful deviation of that, we can then alert to it. So is he touching data that's within HR when he's in a different department? Is he coming in during different working hours, so suddenly logging in at 3 a.m. and accessing a load of stale data? And have we seen a log on from a device that's not associated with him? So that allows us to then alert for any unusual behavior. So going back to the attack that we've just done, what would Varonis see when we run through that? So very quickly, here's all the alerts that were generated during that attack. Some of them are out of order, but you can see the initial malicious file was downloaded. So that was when we uploaded the tools to that endpoint. We can see the password spraying attack that we tried that failed. We can see that once we've done the potential ticket harvesting attack that was successful, we then see a lot of abnormal behavior ones related to the service account as well. So access to atypical files and folders. And then there's one specifically around the folders containing GDPR data. And what is unusual is first time access to the internet. So a service account has a pretty well-defined pattern of behavior. You know, in the case of a backup service, it probably goes on at 3 a.m., does the backup, touches all the files on a file server or in a certain area, and then that's it. If we see that logging on at a different time or accessing the internet for the first time or a device, that's unusual. And then the final one is we can see an unusual amount of data was uploaded to external websites. So when we went through the exfiltration and sent that data out to a non-files, we can see that Varonis has picked that up. So with all of these alerts, what you'll actually see is a summary page. So this summary page puts the information in front of you that you need to actually triage that and decide what to do as a next step. So this potential ticket harvesting attack, we can see the severity info, where it sits in the kill chain. So this is privilege escalation. It's currently an open incident, so no one's triaging it at the moment. And just below that, we can see the actual activity from that engineer account. So we can see that the engineer requested low encrypted access to 5 services. And the key there is that low encrypted access. The reason we did that from an attack perspective is it's going to be much harder or near impossible for us to decrypt those tickets if they're using AES. So we've requested it like we're an old legacy accounting system that isn't compatible with AES. So one of the important things you can do to mitigate Kerber roasting is make sure that your domain controllers are on a high enough functional level. So if they're above 2008, I believe, you can't request those low encrypted tickets. So we can see some risk insights around the user. So they're an engineer. The account wasn't changed in the last 7 days, so it hasn't been recently re-enabled or disabled. They're not on a watch list. We can see one prior alert for that account. So that will be the potential malicious file download. And we can see that that desktop 1 device actually belongs to that engineer. So then when we see the later activity around the backup service, we already have that device pairing and we'll get an alert to say that that device is not associated with it. And we can see that that device itself has also triggered 8 other alerts, most of which being related to the backup service account. Okay, so what I want to do now is move on to Q&A. So if I pass back to Joe.
Thanks, Tom. Let's see some questions in the box. Bear with me 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
So one question we've had is, how do you know when to remove someone's access to data?
Yeah, so I suppose the big question around that is there's always going to be pushback from the business around doing that, because at the end of the day, they don't want to break business continuity. So the way we do it in practice through the automation engine is we look at the activity over a rolling 90-day period. We can extend that, but we look at the activity over that 90 days and we'll only give recommendations around those users that haven't accessed the data using those security groups. So if you're a member of the HR group, but you haven't accessed any of the data that group is on, then we would recommend that you're removed from those groups. The other way that you can do it is you can sandbox the change. So make the change within Varonis and look at the impact of that. So where are they going to lose access to? Is it going to cause any conflicts? And once you've gone through that process, you can be pretty certain that it's not going to cause an impact to that end user if their access is removed, because we haven't got any evidence to say that they are actually touching the data.
Cool, great stuff. Next one is, can Varonis stop ransomware?
Yes, so we went through an example there where the device was, or the user was being logged off, sorry. So that device was shut down, and in that case, we also disabled the account. The way we do that is when we see the activity that looks like ransomware, so the encryption of files, or the user activity looks like a machine activity rather than a user, we can have a script that runs off the back of that that will automatically do whatever you tell it to. So it takes the information from the log, so who was the user, what was the device, what was the IP address, for example, you can just put a PowerShell or a Bash script, something like that, or integrate it with the likes of CrowdStrike, for example, to trigger an event. So another example is if we see a potential malicious file download, we could have a script that run off the back of that that says, you know, perform an endpoint scan on that device. And that's one of the ways that we can stop ransomware as it's happening.
Cool, great stuff. And final question in the box is, can you elaborate on what you mean by the term blast radius?
Yeah, so I mean, it can be seen as a bit of a marketing term, right? But essentially what we mean is, from a single user standpoint, if ransomware is deployed using that user account, where can they access, what can they encrypt, you know, what damage can they do without it propagating to any other users. So if you know what they can access, you therefore know the blast radius or the potential impact of that single user being a victim of ransomware. So the more you can restrict that down, it just means even if ransomware does execute, the actual impact of that is a lot less, perhaps only hitting a single folder or one share rather than the entire file server. So if a standard domain user can get access to anything, even if they're not touching the data because they don't know they have that access, ransomware will, because it will just go through anything that it can access and encrypt it.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Tom. And thanks very much for taking the time today to present to everyone. So I'll just wrap up now, guys. Final piece for us, and then we'll close the call. So keen for you to take advantage of a free of charge cyber resiliency assessment that's on offer from Varonis and Bytes. So some of the topics that Tom has discussed today, we can put this cyber resiliency assessment into your estate and give you a real-time view of your data protection needs and help with that ransomware mitigation side of things. So please take advantage of that. There is a quick poll on your screen now to let us know if you'd like to take advantage of the complimentary cyber resiliency assessment today. If it's not something that you would like to do today, then please reach out to myself or the wider Bytes teams, your account managers here, to either set up a dedicated session or to talk through what that cyber resiliency assessment looks like. It's a very light touch assessment. It's not something that takes a lot of investment in terms of time and resource on your side. So I strongly encourage you to take it up, because we've seen a hell of a lot of customers see real value from that assessment. So yeah, if you could put your answers into the quick poll now. Give it a couple of seconds. Cool. Well, thanks ever so much for your time today. Appreciate everyone's extremely busy at the moment. As I say, if you could fill out the critique form at the end of this session, we'd be very grateful to help guide us in the future. Thanks ever so much for your time, and anything you need at all, please reach out to your Bytes account manager or help me at bytes.co.uk.
Perfect. Thanks.